Jacob, you are chairman of a group of Brexiters called the European Research Group. Last night you put out a statement that you could not vote for any deal that includes an extension of our remaining in what's known as the customs union, which would mean, for example, we couldn't do free trade deals with the rest of the world. The Prime Minister is absolutely clear that there is going to be an extension of our membership of the customs union. So does that mean that you will vote against the deal that she brings back?
Well, it contradicts the Prime Minister's previous position. What was meant to happen was that the period post our leaving, the 21 months, was an implementation period of what had been agreed, not a continuation of negotiations. The idea was that although the EU couldn't formally sign a deal, the outline of it would be agreed and then be signed once we'd left, with 21 months to implement it. What we're now being told is because the government's negotiations haven't achieved this, which a harsher person than me might call a failure, the government is now going to ask for even longer to negotiate without any clear time limit. That is not delivering on Brexit.
So can I be clear, because it is important, people will... You are saying that you yourself, and presumably a number of your colleagues, are now certain to vote against this Brexit deal?
We're not certain because we haven't seen the deal. What I'm saying is that people like me are sticking to the Conservative Party manifesto,
so
which
if there is an extension of our membership of the customs union, that is, for you, to use that dreadful phrase, a red line, and in those circumstances, you would vote against the deal.
I'm sticking to the Conservative Party manifesto that said we would leave the customs union, and it didn't say that we would leave it subject to extending it for years and years and years, potentially. So, yes, you're absolutely right. If there is an extension to the customs union, I will vote against it, because it denies what the Prime Minister herself has said and has promised. And I expect the Prime Minister to deliver on her promises.
And what is your sense of how many of your colleagues feel the same as you?
I think the people who are not happy with this approach is a significant number. Many dozens.
Many dozens, OK. So that risks for her the prospect that she won't get her Brexit deal through Parliament. You are, you know, something of an expert in parliamentary procedure. What then?
Well, a much greater expert than I am is Sir David Nartzler, who is the Under-Clerk of Parliament's the Clerk to the House of Commons, and he gave evidence to the Brexit Select Committee last week, and he made it very clear that the only thing that can change the current act, the Withdrawal Act, is a subsequent act, and that it cannot be changed simply by motions in Parliament. Motions in Parliament can never overturn legislation.
So what does that mean?
That means that the only way to change the Act would either be for the government to decide that it wanted to change the Act, because the government controls the timetable of the House of Commons, or the government to lose a vote of no confidence, which I think is very unlikely.
But sorry, does that mean, so I'm being thick here, but does that broadly mean that in those circumstances you believe that a no-deal Brexit is inevitable?
Parliament has legislated to leave the European Union on the 29th of March 2019, with or without a deal. That's what the Withdrawal Act provides for. Any change to that, any implementation act, would need to get through Parliament between now and the 29th of March. And we mustn't be frightened of having a clean Brexit, leaving on the 29th of March.
Now, I was going to ask you about that, because obviously the government is quite frightened of a no-deal Brexit, even though they claim it's an option.
Well,
you personally don't buy this stuff that we're going to get lorries parked all the way up to London, that we're going to run out of medicines, that, you know, that we're going to get a sort of Dad's Army flotilla of boats taking stuff to Liverpool?
The government is right to make preparations for things going wrong. That's what governments do. It's part of the role of government. And it is right, therefore, that these steps are being taken and that government's considering where the difficulties could arise. But goods coming into the UK will be under our control. We will be able to say these things can carry on coming in. We will not have to implement any restrictions on the moment at which we leave. That will be under our authority, and there are exemptions.
But there will still be bottlenecks if the French decide to implement restrictions, and equally,
yes,
we might be taking security risks, health risks, if we don't impose
there could indeed be bottlenecks in Calais. That's outside the government's control. But no, we wouldn't be taking any risks, because something that's coming from the European Union that is safe on the 29th of March will be safe on the 30th of March. It's fanciful to think that in 24 hours all these dangerous things from the continent will come flooding in. They won't. That's the sort of frightened of my own shadow approach that some Remain campaigners like to take.
Now, you have also called for the government's legal advice on the constitutional implications of the so-called backstop. This is the arrangement that is being negotiated by the Prime Minister to keep open the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. You want that published. Now, all the indications from Downing Street to me is that that won't be published.
It should certainly be made available to Cabinet Ministers so that they know in written form what they are signing up to, because there's a disagreement about what ministers agreed a year ago and whether it meant one thing or another. In terms of legal advice to the House of Commons, I'm much more concerned about whether the deal is a good one or a bad one. But it's perfectly possible to have a legal deal that is a terrible deal, which I would therefore oppose. So this is a secondary issue, but Cabinet government is very important, and there is a concern that the Cabinet is not being fully involved in this. It's getting information at a late stage. There's appearance of it being bounced. You hear of ministers getting 45 minutes to read crucial documents before Cabinet meetings. This is not a serious constitutional approach.
But do you yourself take the view that the interests that you think are important are being protected by Cabinet ministers? Do you think they're actually on your side?
Well, I think there's a discussion in the Cabinet. I think there are some ministers who wish to frustrate Brexit. The Treasury has long decided that Brexit's a bad idea and has put out scare stories throughout the referendum period, all of which turned out to be wrong so far. It promises 800,000 increase in unemployment and a punishment budget and all this sort of stuff. So there are certainly people within the Cabinet and departments of state that are not keen on Brexit, and there are others who are more keen. That often happens, but the government has to come to a unified collective position, or ministers resign.
And just to be clear, the people who tell you that ministers are effectively being bounced, that they're not getting enough information, would I recognise those as reliable sources, as it were?
I think if you spoke to them, you would think they were people who knew what they were talking about.
And why do you think, therefore, ministers are putting up with this?
Well, I don't. We've already had 3 ministers resign, who resigned over Chequers, and we know that ministers were not given access to the Chequers papers until very close to the
So why are this lot tolerating this?
Why are people remaining in office? Because they think it is possible that a deal can be done which they can live with. I think people are perfectly entitled to wait and see. I don't think ministers should have a hair-trigger conscience on resignation. They need to see what the end result is. If they're unhappy with the end result, then different questions arise. But David Davis and Steve Baker were absolutely right to resign because their department had been short-circuited in the production of the Chequers papers. The Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, was right to resign because it was immediately a responsibility of the Foreign Secretary how we're dealing with the continent. Other ministers are getting on with running their own departments and only have to deal with it at the end point.
Now, we're almost out of time. If I could just ask you what I hope is a simple question, which would be to rank 3 options, which would be the kind of Brexit deal that she's likely to negotiate, which may well keep us in the customs union without any unilateral ability to get out of it. Second, remaining in the EU. And third, a no-deal Brexit. What order would you put those in terms of, you know, your own preferences?
I think it would be very hard to get agreement to a customs union without any end point, or which can't be ended unilaterally. Currently, we...
But is that worse for you than staying in the EU? I mean, what I'm trying to get from you is, would your preference be first choice no-deal Brexit, and then staying in the EU, and then last?
Staying in the EU would be an absolute betrayal of the largest exercise in democracy this country has ever had. That must be the worst result.
You think that is even worse than the kind of Brexit she's likely to deliver to you?
I think what is currently being gossiped about, if Sunday Times is right on what's being proposed, that's a pretty poor runner. And I think if that were the option, if those were the 3 options, we would find that the most likely outcome was an accidental departure of a clean Brexit, which wouldn't be great because you need a government to embrace a clean Brexit and to be positive about it and to work out the steps that need to be taken to ensure that there aren't any difficulties, or such difficulties as there are minimised. And I don't think getting to it by accident would create those circumstances.